It started with a sharp, jarring sound. At 9 years old, I was no stranger to strange noises in the night, but this one was different. It wasn't the creak of the old house settling or the wind rattling the windows. It was the doorbell. My parents were asleep in their room down the hall, my younger brother lying between them, feverish and pale. He'd been sick all day, and my mom had promised to stay close in case he needed anything. I was supposed to be asleep too, but the persistent chime of the bell jolted me upright. It was past midnight, the house eerily silent except for that sound. Ding-dong, ding-dong, over and over, like someone was leaning on the button. I crept out of bed, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. From the top of the stairs I could see the front door, its frosted glass glowing faintly from the porch light. A shadow shifted behind it, large and indistinct. Before I could call out, the doorbell stopped. The silence was worse somehow, thick and suffocating. Then came the pounding. Heavy, deliberate fists against the wood, each strike reverberating through the house. I ran to my parents' room, my heart hammering in my chest. "Someone's at the door," I whispered, tugging on my mom's arm. She stirred, groggy and disoriented. "What? Who is it?" "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling. "They're pounding on the door." That got her attention. She sat up, waking my dad. They both exchanged a glance, their faces tight with worry. My dad got up, pulling on his robe as he headed toward the stairs. My mom followed, clutching my brother close, her hand gripping my shoulder. The pounding continued, relentless and angry. My dad stopped at the bottom of the stairs, staring at the door. "Who's there?" he called, his voice firm but tinged with unease. No answer. "Who is it?" he repeated, louder this time. The pounding stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. Then, faintly, we heard a voice, a low, frantic mumble, words we couldn't quite make out. My mom pulled me closer. "Don't open it," she whispered. My dad didn't move, his hand hovering near the doorknob. The voice on the other side grew louder, more desperate. It was then we noticed the flicker of red and blue lights outside, casting eerie shadows through the frosted glass. At 5 a.m., the police and fire department arrived. I didn't understand much of what happened next, only bits and pieces overheard as my parents spoke to the officers. The person at the door wasn't some intruder or dangerous stranger. It was our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Whitaker. She'd panicked after smelling smoke in her house and, in her disoriented state, had come to us for help. The fire department found no fire, only a faulty oven that had filled her kitchen with smoke. I remember standing in the doorway, clutching my mom's hand as I watched Mrs. Whitaker being escorted back to her house, her frail figure dwarfed by the towering firefighters. She looked embarrassed, her hands wringing nervously as she apologized over and over. The incident became something of a lesson in the neighborhood, a story told with equal parts humor and relief. But for me, it was something more. It was the first time I'd felt true fear, the kind that creeps under your skin and settles deep in your chest. Even now, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, ears straining for the sound of a doorbell. The memory of that night lingers, a reminder of how easily safety can feel fragile, even in the places we call home. The Johnsons moved in during the summer, a family of 4 with bright smiles and a dog that barked too much. They seemed normal enough, a couple in their 40s and 2 teenage kids, friendly, but not overly chatty. They waved when we crossed paths and even brought cookies when they introduced themselves. At first it was easy to like them. Their yard was always neat, and they kept to themselves. But as the months went by, something started to feel off. It began with the backyard activity. Late at night, long after the neighborhood had gone quiet, I'd see the flicker of their outdoor floodlights. The father, Greg, would be out there, shoveling or moving things, always alone. Sometimes his wife or kids would come out briefly, but they never stayed for long. Then came the smell. It crept in slowly, faint at first, like something rotting far away. But as the weeks passed, it grew stronger, more pungent. By late September, the odor was unbearable. Walking past their fence felt like wading through a swamp of decay. The neighborhood began to murmur. Maybe their dog died, someone suggested. They probably compost, another said. But compost didn't smell like this, and it didn't make sense for them to leave a dead pet out in the open. Curiosity got the better of me one evening. It was just after sunset, and the Johnsons' yard was quiet. I slipped into my own backyard where the smell was strongest and peeked through a gap in the wooden fence. At first, I couldn't make out much, just shadows and the faint outline of their patio furniture. But then I saw it. Near the corner of their yard, tucked behind some bushes, was a large container. It looked like one of those heavy-duty plastic bins, the kind you use for storing tools or winter clothes. The lid was slightly ajar, and even from a distance I could see what was inside. Animal carcasses. Dozens of them piled on top of each other. Rabbits, raccoons, birds, some partially decomposed, others fresh enough to look like they'd been collected that day. The smell hit me full force, and I had to clap a hand over my mouth to keep from gagging. I stumbled back, heart racing. What were they doing with these animals? Why would anyone collect them? The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I debated whether to confront Greg or call someone, animal control, maybe even the police. But I hesitated. What if I was wrong? What if there was some explanation, strange but harmless? That evening, as I mulled over my options, I noticed Greg in his backyard again. This time he wasn't alone. His teenage son stood beside him, holding a flashlight. Greg was hunched over the container, sorting through its contents. I couldn't tell what he was doing, but every so often he'd glance around as if making sure no one was watching. I didn't confront him directly, but I couldn't resist trying to learn more. A few nights later, I crept back to the fence, hoping to get a closer look. But the container was gone. In its place was freshly turned soil, as if they'd buried whatever had been inside. The smell was still there, faint but lingering. The next morning I saw Greg loading something into his truck, a series of large black bags. He caught me staring and froze for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled, gave me a wave, and drove off. After that, the smell disappeared entirely. So did the late-night activities. The Johnsons continued to wave and smile, but there was a stiffness to it now, a forced politeness. I avoided them as much as I could. To this day, I don't know what I saw. Were they hunters, storing their kills in the most grotesque way imaginable? Or was it something darker? The Johnsons moved out the following year. The house sat empty for months before a new family moved in. I never brought it up to anyone, not even my closest friends. Some secrets are better left buried, literally. The annual block party was the highlight of our summer, a rare moment when the whole street came alive. Kids darted between the picnic tables, their laughter echoing in the warm evening air, while neighbors swapped stories over barbecues and drinks. It was the kind of event that made you feel like you belonged. That year, Mr. Grayson was the newcomer. He'd moved in 2 months earlier, renting the small, unassuming house at the end of the cul-de-sac. At first, he kept to himself, his curtains always drawn, his car slipping in and out of the driveway at odd hours. He hadn't attended the previous neighborhood get-togethers, but the block party seemed to lure him out. When he showed up, he didn't blend in. His wiry frame and pale complexion stood out among the tanned, cheerful crowd. He hovered near the edges of the gathering, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his khakis, nodding awkwardly when someone greeted him. At first I thought he was just shy, maybe a bit socially awkward. But as the evening wore on, his behavior grew harder to ignore. He didn't seem interested in chatting with the other adults. Instead, his gaze followed the children. I noticed it when my daughter ran past him, her curls bouncing as she chased her friends toward the bounce house. His head turned to watch her, his eyes lingering a moment too long. It wasn't overt, nothing I could definitively point to, but it left an uncomfortable knot in my stomach. Later, I saw him near the drink table, speaking to one of the kids from down the block. He leaned in too close, his posture rigid, his words almost inaudible over the hum of the party. The child's face was blank, her eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. I tried to shake off my unease. Maybe he wasn't used to events like this. Maybe he was just awkward with kids. But then I overheard a snippet of conversation. "Kids are so full of energy," he said, his voice low but audible. "You can feel it, can't you? Like they radiate something pure." I froze. It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. His tone was too soft, too reverent, like he was talking about something sacred. I mentioned it to a friend later that night, but she brushed it off. "He's probably just trying to make conversation," she said, sipping her drink. "Not everyone's good at this sort of thing." I wanted to believe her, but something about Mr. Grayson's presence stuck with me. Over the next few weeks, I kept an eye on him. He rarely left his house during the day, but at night, I'd sometimes see his shadow moving behind the curtains. He didn't interact much with the neighbors, and when he did, it was always brief and stilted. Then, one evening, the flashing red and blue lights of police cars lit up our street. The commotion drew everyone outside, whispers spreading as we watched officers lead Mr. Grayson out of his house in handcuffs. The charges were sickening. He'd been caught with an extensive collection of inappropriate content involving children. The details were too horrific to process fully, but they confirmed what I'd feared. In the days that followed, the neighborhood buzzed with conversation. Some people expressed shock, claiming they'd never suspected a thing. Others, like me, admitted they'd felt something was off but hadn't known what to do about it. Looking back, the signs seemed so obvious. The way he lingered near the kids at the block party, the unsettling comments, the quiet intensity with which he observed everything. But at the time, it was all too easy to dismiss, to write off as eccentricity or social awkwardness. The block party has never felt the same since. Every year, when the tents go up and the grills are fired, there's a lingering unease, a reminder that danger doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it stands quietly at the edge of the crowd, watching.